Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. This channel is dedicated to finding out whether I really do know it all or not. We will see. Make sure you like and subscribe. My wife goes through the emails and comments and ferrets out good questions for me to read and answer to see if I know it all. So we will see what today's is. Drum roll, please. Okay. What is the most powerful rocket to fly? Ooh. All right, I think I can answer this one pretty quickly. The most powerful rocket to successfully fly is considered to be the Saturn V rocket. That was the rocket that took men to the moon. I would say people, but it was actually all men. So anyway, that was the one. It used 5 F1 engines in the first stage. I believe 5 J2 engines in the second stage, 1 in the third, and then some smaller stuff for the command module and the service module to get back and forth around. So I'm going to go ahead and check the answer now, but we will see anyway, and then I'll talk a little bit more about it in just a second. So 1 sec. All right. So, yep, as I suspected, yay! The Saturn V is indeed the most powerful rocket to ever fly. There was some competition. The Soviet N-1 rocket that was supposed to take Soviet cosmonauts to the moon in the late 60s as the competition with the U.S. Was, I think, gosh, it had a ridiculous number of engines. I think like 23 or something like that. And it was potentially more powerful, but it never flew without exploding. I'll try to throw up a video here because it's a pretty impressive explosion when it goes off. Anyway, they had a lot of trouble with controlling the number of engines that they had at the time. The most powerful rocket that is flying today, as of 2019, is the Falcon Heavy. That surpassed, I believe, the Delta IV. I believe was the Delta IV Heavy was the most powerful one also before that. Of course, these are liquid-fueled rockets, and there's some give and take, and what's the most powerful engine and so forth. For example, the solid rocket boosters that were on the space shuttle, on the sides of the space shuttle, those had an immense amount of power. They're a whole different category of rocket, though, because they're basically an uncontrolled burn. Like, you light them, and they just go. If you've ever done model rocketry, that's, you know, it's the same basic thing as those little teeny model rockets that, model rocket engines, those cartridges, and just much more sophisticated. But it's, once you light those things, they go until they stop burning. And of course, that made the launches for the space shuttle, and the fact that they didn't have an escape system, it made it incredibly dangerous to fly those. So anyway, liquid-fueled rockets have an advantage because they are throttleable and controllable and so forth. And of course, the space shuttle did actually have the, was it RS-32 engines? They had the 3 engines that were pretty impressive engines. Still to this day, they're very impressive engines because they basically operate from sea level up into space, into orbit. And that is not exactly a simple thing to do because of the engine. Not the engine, but the bell shape, the exhaust shape, which shapes the exhaust, and it needs to be different it needs to be optimized for vacuum versus sea level. Which is one of the reasons why there are staged rockets most of the time. One of the reasons, of course, is just weight, because you've got all this stuff. Once it burns out, you might as well just throw it away. But also, once you get up above the atmosphere, the exhaust plume becomes much less efficient, because what you want, of course, is Newton's third law. You want to throw things exactly this direction in order to go this way. And as it becomes higher up in the atmosphere and loses atmosphere, the plume fades out like that, and that's not nearly as efficient as pushing the rocket forward. So you'll notice that second stage engines are second stage exhaust bells, the engine, sorry. The actual engine is a very, very small thing. All of this, you know, plumbing and stuff goes into a really small combustion chamber, relatively speaking, and then it gets directed out these engine bells. And the engine bells for upper stages, again, I'll try to throw some graphics in here, are much, much, much larger. And that's because there is no resistance from the atmosphere, because it's a vacuum. And so they have to kind of, they should actually be infinitely large in order to direct all the exhaust to go straight backwards. But of course, they can't make them infinitely large. They have to fit inside the rocket itself. So they make them really big, and they effectively create a exhaust that goes just one direction, so it can push it the other way. Anyway, the most I may have gotten off track here. I tend to do that a lot. The most powerful one today, again, is the Falcon Heavy that's flying now. If SpaceX has its way within the next year or so, we should see Starship and Super Heavy go into orbit, and those would kind of blow away any previous records. Those would definitely take over. But at present, at least, the Saturn V is the heaviest rocket, the biggest, the tallest rocket, and the most powerful rocket to have ever flown. And amazingly enough, it actually had a perfect track record. I believe it was the second launch. It almost destroyed itself. It did what was called a pogo, where the thrust, they had not figured out how to get the how to inject, basically fuel injectors like in your car. They hadn't figured out how to inject the fuel in a perfectly laminar way. And there's actually really fascinating history about all of that goes into how they had to create this crazy intake port that would push the fuel and the oxygen into it in a very specific way to keep it from sloshing. The result, if it sloshes, is that you get too much fuel or oxygen or whatever in the combustion chamber, and then that would cause it to have more thrust, and then that thrust would cause it to like flood, basically, like you'd have too little fuel. It would get a little too hot, right? It'd go oxygen rich or something like that. Anyway, it caused the combustion chamber to flood because it would force more fuel into the combustion chamber. Then it would essentially flood and become too fuel rich. It would then not have enough fuel, so it would slow down a little bit, and then it would go ka-junk, 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 right? As it's going up, it was accelerating and decelerating internally. And I think Apollo 4 was the first one that actually flew, and that one flew well, and it was Apollo 5, I believe, that had these problems. I'll throw up which one it was. I think it was Apollo 5. Anyway, but they said that if human beings had been on the capsule at the time, it was an unmanned flight, that they would have probably died because they would have been shaking to death. And it almost destroyed all the electronics. Speaking of which, interestingly enough, what was it called? The LVDC. So everybody knows about the Apollo guidance computer, at least in the community, right? So that was the thing that was on the command module, and also there was one on the the command module, and also on the lunar module to take people down to the moon itself. But everybody knows about that as a very compact, circuit design, very cool old thing. Let me see if I've got. Where is that? Aha. This is what I get for Christmas. So that's how geeky I am. I get things like Digital Apollo, where you can actually find out about how the AGC worked. But the interesting thing is, much less kind of sung hero of all this is the LVDC, which is the Launch Vehicle Digital Computer. Yeah, Launch Vehicle Digital Computer. The Apollo guidance computer was built by MIT and Raytheon, I think. The LVDC was built by IBM, who of course was they still are a powerhouse, but they were the powerhouse back in the 60s. And so they built this amazing thing. And so it's at the ring at the top of the third stage, right where the lunar module kind of fit into the casing, where it would go down to where the service module was. So there's like a kind of a taper, and below that is a ring, and that ring contained all of this equipment, the computers and so forth. And when they say computer, it wasn't one computer, it was like a mass of different things. I'll throw up some pictures. They have an example of this in Huntsville, Alabama, where the Saturn V was actually built. And it's an amazing display, and you can go and you can see just how they built the memory cores and how all the individual pieces were done, and it's super cool. So anyway, that's kind of an unsung hero of the Apollo era, and people talk about the AGC all the time, and it was an ingenious thing, and it was an amazing computer, and it got us back and forth to the moon and so forth. But the LVDC was in some ways even more critical, because the AGC you could reference things from Earth most of the time, except for actually during the lunar landing itself. But for most of the time, the massive computers that they had at NASA, they could send information and the AGC would confirm it and so forth. But the LVDC had to make real-time decisions during the most critical part of the flight, which was the launch, right, where everything is going crazy, and it had to make all of those decisions completely autonomously without any errors, no problems. Nothing could happen wrong, or else the whole thing could get out of control and explode, right? So bad news could happen. So anyway, it's that's a very cool aspect of that. I've kind of gotten off of things, but anyway, so going back to the basic answer here, Saturn V to this day is the most powerful rocket that's flown. It used F1 engines for its first stage, just amazing engines. They were made by Rocketdyne, I think. The Falcon Heavy is the most powerful rocket that is flying today. And if SpaceX is able to do this within about 12 months from when this video is shot, we should have orbital class Starship / Super Heavy, which would completely blow away any records and by far be the most powerful rocket that has ever flown. All right, so hopefully that was a fun answer. And again, make sure you like and subscribe, and especially make sure you ask questions either in the comments or email it to me at DrKnowItAllKnows@gmail.com. And my wife, again, goes through these things. She ferrets out interesting questions, and she sticks them on a piece of paper, and I answer them, and we'll see how I do, right? Thank you so much. Until next time, bye-bye.